Ayuki, Nani Eras, hello, how are you, my people? Welcome back for another episode of our Indigenous Virtual Speaker Series. Really excited about today's speaker. I think you guys will like what he has to say and the things that he's going to teach us. Um, I'd like to start off by letting you guys know we're here in Humboldt County, 5 hours north of San Francisco. For those of you who are new to this speaker series, a couple hours from the border of Oregon. And just to give you guys kind of perspective of where we come from, we got a weather of 60 today, so kind of moderate. So enjoy it the best you can. High overcast, so you got some pretty good filtered light. Anyways, enough of that. But Virgil, all on you.
Hello, I'm Virgil Moorhead. I work here at Two Feathers as the Behavioral Health Director, trained as a clinical psychologist and part of the Big Lagoon Rancheria, which is Yurok and Talawa. And I'm happy to introduce our guest today, which is Dr. Phillip Deloria. He's a very well-respected scholar, historian, and he has a little bit about his background is that he has a PhD in American Studies from Yale, and he is the first to be a professor at Harvard University in Native American history. I was reading over the article that the Harvard magazine shared or wrote about Dr. Deloria, and one of his colleagues, Daniel Lord Smale, said, Dr. Deloria is the complete package in so many ways, hands down the leading authority in Native American history, and incredibly charismatic leader. So I think that's enough introduction with that high praise from your fellow colleague. Welcome, Dr. Deloria.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
And we're glad to have you. So let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about your more recent book about your great aunt, Mary Sully. And my opening question is if you can talk a little bit about that book, but specifically for the readers that are the audience that may not have read the book, and just give you a sort of a general overview of the book, but also specifically, what were the questions that were for yourself that were guiding that work and the development of that this project and that ended up with a book?
Yeah. So first, let me just say I wish everybody out there, good health, safety, wellness. Everybody, I hope everybody's taking good care of themselves in this most interesting time. Second thing, Dan Smale, he's the chair of my department. He has to say stuff like that, but there are so many people out there who are better historians than me. I just want to sort of, say that up front. Right. We can't let that kind of talk get to our heads. So here's the book. So I've been working on this book for about 10 years, and I have kind of worked through it as a series of talks. I'd give it as a talk, and people would say interesting things about this collection of art that I was showing as part of the talk. And then I would go and rework the talk, and then I would think some more. So the book developed in kind of a weird, sort of way. And the talk was always a series of kind of reveals. Halfway through, I'd kind of drop some new information on you that was kind of interesting. And the big information drop is that the artist here in question, Mary Sully, is actually my great aunt, Susie Deloria, who, did her art under the name Mary Sully. So she had this kind of artist's sort of name. And this is stuff that came into our family in the mid 70s when my other great aunt, Ella Deloria, was quite well known and respected as a Dakota language, ethnographer. When she passed on, some of her materials all went to my grandfather, and among the collection of materials was this art that had been done by her sister. And my grandfather sent it down to, to us, my family, and my mom and I went through this box and we pulled out all this art, and we just couldn't really make sense of it. It was really interesting. It was kind of weird. Each of the pieces, there's 134 of these pieces that were in the box. And each piece has the name of a person or a personality attached to it. I should say, not all of them. Some of them are kind of ideas, and some of them are sort of a little hard to pin down. But most of them are just people, the names of people. So like Babe Ruth, or Franklin D. Roosevelt, or people like that. And so each one has a name attached to it, and each piece is really three separate pieces of paper stuck together. I pulled a print out and I stuck it behind my shoulder here. So you can see I've got this really nice Earl Biss lithograph back there, but I'm covering up Earl Biss, today. So you can see there's, I don't know, this is probably kind of goofy, isn't it? You see there's three sort of images, here. And the top one is always this kind of mostly representational, or sometimes kind of symbolic, sort of abstract sometimes. The second one's always a design pattern. And the bottom one's always kind of a native pattern, drawn from Great Plains women's traditions of parfleche painting, beadwork, quill work, quilting, these kinds of things. So so the art is super interesting. I think it's incredibly beautiful. When my mom and I opened the box, we just couldn't make sense of it because we didn't know who half these people were. Some of them were obvious people, but a lot of them were not obvious at all, and we couldn't really make sense of the art. And then the art got put away for a while, and after my dad passed in 2005, my mom and I kind of pulled it back out again, and I started thinking about it more. And the difference was you could Google people, in 2006, and you couldn't Google people in 1975. And so we pulled out the art and we started Googling who these people were. And one of the things that just exploded in my head was how smart and interesting the art was once you knew who the people were. So so the question that was really motivating the project was, what was going on, in her head? Did she see herself as an artist? Was this just kind of for fun? Was it, what was the nature of her sense of herself, as an artist, as a Native woman artist in that particular moment of the 1930s, I should say, which is when she did almost, all of these. Did she see herself fitting into the kind of what were then sort of emergent traditions of, American Indian art in the context of American art? Or did she see herself in other kinds of ways? Because one of the stories that always came down to us, and many stories about her came down to us, that she was so shy, she wouldn't really leave the house. She just stayed up in her room and made art, all the time. But at the same time, my other great aunt Ella had sort of crafted a role for her, a place, kind of kinship place, really. So she was Ella's driver. So she was actually a very fine auto mechanic and driver, and she drove around. She drove Ella all over the place from New York City out to South Dakota and back. And so she was Ella's driver. So she was able to move through the world. She lived in New York City. She was able to sort of move in the anonymous kind of dimensions of the city. But when it came to a small social group, she just hid herself away. She didn't really talk to people. So she was an interesting person, right? And a curious, kind of person. So I wanted to try to make sense of her. Who was she? How did she think about herself? And then I wanted to make sense of her art. And then I wanted to make sense of the art in the larger context of both American Indian art and American art.
Yeah, and I thought, when I emailed you, and that was one of the things that you talked about, was I want to talk about my recent book. So I read the book and your book, and when I initially got into it, I was like, oh, abstract Indian art. This should be interesting. I can't say that I was totally enthusiastic about reading it, but man, it was a fabulous read. I think, one of the things that I saw that you say that in your writing that you're, trying based from your previous books to be better at storytelling in your writing. And I think that you did a fabulous job at telling the story. And so the question that I have on, you have the question is really getting in more in depth of your process of answering those questions, because through reading the book, you went at it from many different angles, in the sense of psychology, in the sense of history, politics, culture. And so just kind of speaking about your process of answering the questions that initially led you to write the book.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think this is partly this is my third sort of big book. And I've had a different process in every one. My first book's called Playing Indian. It's about non-native people who dress up and play like Indians, perform like Indians. And that book like unspooled in my head in about 30 seconds. Like I saw a picture of little kids dressed up like Indians. A guy next to me said, have you heard of this improved order of red men, this fraternal society? I thought about the Boston Tea Party. I thought about being in Boulder, Colorado with New Agers. And it's like, bam, there's this whole book. White Americans love to dress up like Indians, and they always have. And what's that about? My second book, Indians in Unexpected Places, was this. I wrote an essay about Indians and cars. And then I wrote an essay about my grandfather as an athlete. And then I was always interested in music, and I kind of wrote an essay about music. And I thought these things were all disconnected. My editor of my press said, like, this is a single story. You got to put them all together. And that was long and laborious and painstaking, and I never really felt like I got there. Totally different methods. And then this book was completely different, also. It's really started, I had to give a talk at the Museum of the American Indian, National Museum of the American Indian, and the American Art. Smithsonian institutions were sort of doing a joint conference. I did do a 20-minute paper. And I had no idea what to talk about. And I thought, I'm just going to pull out this art and just talk about it and just do a little riff on it, So I did this little 20-minute thing, and all these art historians came up and they said, like, you gotta do something with this. This stuff is really cool. You don't know how cool this stuff is. And I thought it was pretty cool. Anyway, so to do this project, I kind of had to make myself into something of an art historian. And so I kind of reverse engineered things that were interesting to me in my own head. I've always been interested in material culture, and in doing really fine-grained kind of interpretive work with material culture. So I kind of reverse engineered that back into doing it with art, and tried to make myself into a person who could do kind of art analysis. And then, like I said, I started doing this as a talk. And so I would do a little bit of analysis and a little bit of context. And then it just got deeper and deeper and deeper, every time I did it. And it took on the form of kind of like peeling back the onion, So the whole project was kind of conceived as like, okay, here's this Native woman who doesn't actually on the face seem very talented or very interesting, wrong. Peel back the first layer, right? Now let's talk about like where she comes from, who her family is. Well, it turns our family story is a pretty interesting family story, right? So family history became really important there, Well, does that tell the whole story of her? No, peel back the next layer of the onion, right? And think like she had interesting stuff going on in her head, and what was the nature of that? How do we think about that? As from reading the book, I did some kind of speculative stuff about, did she have synesthesia, right? Did she have kind of perceptual crossings happening within her mind, or did she have other things going on? So I kind of tried to pull back the onion there. And then I thought, well, does that really explain the art? And I thought, no, I got to pull back the onion a little bit more, that she's in the context of all these modernist artists of the teens and the 20s who are thinking about personality and people. And so she's in that context really clearly. And then, and so it was just this constant sort of peeling back, getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and I think one of the things that ends up happening over the course of the book is, I really start with her family history and her sort of personal psychology. I move into these contextual things. And over the course of the book, I start drifting her further and further away, in some ways, from, her position as a Native woman into the big, broad contexts of American history. And then what I wanted to do at the end, though, was to bring her right back into that context and show the ways in which her indigenous sort of the dimensions of the way she was thinking, of way she was situated, within her family, within her kin group, in relation to the language work that her sister was doing, that these things were absolutely fundamentally central, that she wasn't just an Indian woman kind of doing abstract art, but she was an Indian woman doing Native art in a modernist kind of context. And in that, she was like one of the most innovative people of the 1930s, of the 20th century, right? Because we know when we get real Indian modernism, right, it starts happening with super brilliant and creative artists, in the 1940s. She was doing this stuff in the 1930s, So, I want to make the case that she belongs like in the canon of Native art, but she belongs in the canon of American art as a really fundamentally important, kind of innovator. So I worked through those kinds of things, and reaching that insight at the end that, the figure of the double woman, this Dakota, kind of epistemological figure, was absolutely key to understanding her and making sure that like the readers of this book understand that she is first and foremost, a Dakota woman with this incredible global kind of cosmopolitan sort of vision, that there's nobody else like her out there, I don't think. So you can tell I love her.
Yeah,
I love her. I love this work. This is the best project I'll ever have in my entire career. It is all downhill from here for me.
I think that came across your enthusiasm and just deep work. And, really, it seems like I can only imagine how much, work it put into thinking that broadly and deeply about the artwork and Mary. I know one of the things that other colleagues of yours have said is that you helped to change Native American history and really bring culture into history through your American studies training. And I know at the end of this book, sort of one of the things that you said is that maybe this work and this process can change how we look at and do history. And so I'm curious, like, if you can unpack that a little bit, because I think that we have educators, administrators, others that are very interested in Native American history. But, I'm really interested in in your thoughts about the process and what you mean by, changing or just engaging in history maybe differently from this project.
I mean, I think it's, I am situated in this interesting place, right? I'm an American studies person. I do care a lot about culture. Care a lot about art representation, and that's where my work is always, my work's always been. But I've always been in history departments, and I've had to teach history methods, and I've had to sort of make myself into, a regular historian. But I think one of the things that, has always been knocking around in my head is that the, kind of historical consciousness of the discipline of history, right, is a Western consciousness, and that there are other ways of thinking about time and thinking about space. And that, certainly I've seen this in terms of my own family and in terms of things I've come to understand, that, there are other ways of thinking time and space. So one of the things at the very end of this book, I think, Virgil, this is the part you're referring to, where I sort of make this weird move and say, okay, here's a woman whose art remained completely anonymous in her own time. Like nobody saw it. She had 3 little showings, 2 of them were at Indian schools, right? So nobody saw this art. So a conventional historical narrative would tell you, therefore, she could have had no influence on anything that would have happened afterwards. But I think if you think about time and space and influence and things differently, you can make a different argument, right? That she is absolutely fundamental to that particular moment, and that you can't understand the history that unspooled after her without understanding her. So it's a complete effort to rewrite history. And I mean, to make that argument, I actually do this weird kind of thing where I invoke the French theorist Bruno Latour, but the argument I think is kind of analogous. I mean, what he says is, hey, we used to have this thing called modernity, the modern, and that was when everybody separated nature and culture from one another. And then they built epistemological systems, based on the separation of nature and culture. But he says, God, now we're at this point, we realize like that was wrong. And nature and cultures are not separate, and they shouldn't be separate. And therefore, now we sit at this place, we have to rewrite and unspool all that history that we thought we had made, because like he's the title of his book is We Have Never Been Modern. Like we never were modern. That was all false. So he's sitting at this particular moment and asking us to unspool, our history. And it feels like that's the argument I wanted to make in this book, as well, that like you can take an anonymous person, a butterfly's wing that flaps across the globe that actually has effects, right, elsewhere that you can't necessarily see, right, but which are there. And I think that goes to the ways in which, Indigenous peoples understand, the causalities of the world, which are not readily apparent, right? But which are there, nonetheless. So I'd like to think that the book, despite all of its art historical stuff and its historical stuff, in the end has a kind of stake in the ground, asking readers to sort of be willing and open to think about things, in a different way. And I will say, this completely draws on some of the later work that my dad was doing, thinking about, when you take a string physicist or a quantum mechanics, person and let them kind of go late at night, maybe with a beverage in hand, they say crazy, crazy stuff that starts sounding a lot like what native, medicine people say, right? Different ways of thinking about time and space and energy and mind and matter, and who's to say that there wasn't an indigenous science, right, that developed that over time and understood some of the things that modern physicists are just getting at from their own edges, so that's not my idea. That's completely my dad's idea and his sort of thinking about this stuff. And I never quite understood what he was talking about. And I'm just trying to sort of claw my way back into sort of some of the things that he was thinking in that book. That argument sort of fits in there.
Thank you. And that kind of brings up to another question that I had is that, Two Feathers and where we work is primarily a sort of social services mental health agency. And so we're doing individual therapy and self-reflection. And so, in reading this book and your the history in your family and how many people on the Deloria side and the Sully were so prominent in, I think, American history, and really like just fascinating the connections that you made with, in a large part, your family and how, prominent they have been. And so my question is like, how is this process for yourself, or and maybe more broadly just throughout your life of really getting in depth understanding and reflection on who you are as a Deloria, who you are, where you come from, how is that process for you, and what do you think how has it helped you in your own life, and whether it's just personally and your career?
Yeah, I mean, I've said two really contradictory things, about this book. Is, one, I've said, okay, for those people who understand sort of Native history and Native studies, like, yeah, I'm about to inflict yet another Deloria, on the world. And because there is an odd dynamic, right, about how family stuff, works, and how certain families, and I don't know why, right, how certain families have certain kinds of legacies and certain kinds of things. And, in effect, sort of surfacing my great aunt, is part of a contributing, contribution to that kind of legacy, but on the other hand, well, yeah, you can tell, like, this has always been a hard question for me, right? Back to the days when I first started my career, and my dad and I were in the same department at the University of Colorado and actually shared the same office, and I used to get calls from people saying like, yeah, your dad can't come to this meeting. Can you come? And, it's on the one hand, you're like, no, don't do that to me, and on the other hand, it's like, how can you not want to be part of the legacy of your father, of your family, of those kinds of things? So, so on the one hand, there's this great deal of pride, I think, that's associated and attached with it, and a great deal of meaning that comes out of it. And on the other hand, I think there's the invocation that we all have to humility, right? Which is like, I don't know why this family, and I don't know how it happens. And, and I don't necessarily want to make that big a deal out of it, right? So you're kind of caught in this sort of, sort of double motion, kind of thing around this. But I have to say, I mean, I felt the need over the last couple of years to do, this is a bit of a rehabilitation project, because I mean, she, in real life, I mean, her, she was kind of the quiet one, the odd one, a part of the argument of the book is that she's a genius, she's a kind of quiet genius. But, in our family, and I think in the general telling of the story of, that generation of the Delorias, it's Ella, her sister, who is the genius, right? Who works with Franz Boas at Columbia, who does all this incredible language preservation and revitalization work. It's Ella who's the genius, and Susie or Mary, who's the sort of tag along. But what you realize is that like these two sisters were like this, they were generating back and forth the intellectual work that they were doing. And so Ella's genius can't be separated out from Susie's genius. And Susie's genius, I think, can't be separated out from Ella's genius and what Ella was doing, as well. So yeah, it's a deep point of pride for me, to sort of think about reclaiming her, because I think back to the, she died in 1963, and I think like that she hadn't made art in a while, she'd had a series of health issues and things. And you have to think like, how must it have been for her, in her last years, thinking like, oh, I devoted, I don't know, 15, 20 years of my life to this art project and not much, So the fact that she can, be the subject of a book, 2 of these pieces are in the Hearts of Our People show that started at Minneapolis Institute of Arts and is now at the Smithsonian at the Renwick Gallery. My wife and I went to the opening at Minneapolis, and we just stood there and cried, and just thought like, this is so fantastic that she, from obscurity, and had to think that she was sitting here sort of hopefully looking down with a happy smile on her face.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I have one more comment before I turn it over to Charlie for a question. That was one of the things that I took from your book is the dedication of Ella towards her sister. Just I think as mental health professionals, like, because she could have been, in today's time, hospitalized possibly, or, imagine what her life would have turned out if she didn't have her sister, who pretty much, took her, and they were, together their whole life on and off. And so my question is, and I think it kind of maybe speaks to also kind of follow up to what you just said, is like, where does that dedication, that passion towards family, towards, tradition, maybe in the case of, because it seems like your father, Vine, had the same sort of passion and dedication to helping Indian people. And you, with this remarkable book about your great aunt and really bringing her back to relevance and really maybe honoring all, her life. Like, where does that, do you think, in your family come from? Is it the Dakota tradition? Is it family patterns? Is it the church? Where is it that comes? Because it seems like it's a thread that runs through some of your family, or maybe a lot of your family.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of all those things. The church is kind of their vessel for sort of preserving a lot of Dakota culture, and kinship is part of that. I think it partly comes out of Ella and Susie's own upbringing, right, which is in the church, but also in sort of Dakota communities. And then I think it gets super intensified when Ella starts doing sort of ethnographic work, and she's a person who's sort of been a little bit on the borders, on the margins, because she is a churchy person in that sense, and they're churchy people throughout their entire lives. But when she starts diving into the ethnographic stuff, and this all comes through her father, right? Franz Boas sends her out to the Dakota reservations, and she goes right to her father and says like, hey, I have to invent ethnography, out here, a Dakota ethnography. What should I do? And of course he says, let me tell you who your relatives are, who you can go and talk to. And you can talk to these guys about this stuff, but don't talk about this. And you can talk to these guys about this stuff, but don't talk about that, And so, Ella goes and basically has this whole series of, deeply educational interviews. And over time, she becomes more and more and more and more committed to Dakota language and to Dakota culture, and in particular to kinship. For her, it is everything. When she writes on this, you can just feel the glow off the page when she's talking about kinship kinds of relations and obligations. So for her, kinship, we talked today about relationality and reciprocity and respect and all those things. And that's, for her, was the embodiment of, kinship. right, was to be in relation, to have reciprocal kinds of obligations, to other people, and to fulfill those things. And so when it really becomes clear that Susie just can't really function, on her own, I mean, Ella creates this role for her and basically caretakes her for the rest of her life. And Ella does something quite similar with her own father, who suffers a series of strokes. She had just started working for Franz Boas. She went out to her first summer of field work in South Dakota, and then came back, passed through, and ended up sort of caretaking her father, and refused to leave him for 2 years. And Boaz keeps writing her and saying, like, I got to get you back here in New York. I need you. And she's like, yeah, I don't know what you people do with your families, but like, we don't abandon our parents. And so she's willing to sacrifice all kinds of things. She's always puts her kinship obligations first. And I think that comes out of her deepening over time, of her sense of how important it is, in Dakota culture and ways of being.
And do you think that, just a little follow-up, that you've seen that in your own life? I think one of the things you had said recently, semi-recently, is that you've kind of had a little bit more interest in your father and his work over, I don't know, maybe the last decade. And so have you seen that in your own life and in this process of like looking more deeply at, kinship? I mean, from, music to, being a middle school music teacher, and then kind of going, to this book, which was deeply personal. Just curious about your own life and that process that you described, like with Ella.
I mean, I think Ella, sitting there in the late 20s, 30s, and 40s, I mean, she had a window on to the way that like life used to be with kinship kinds of relationships in small communities and communities that had, and I think doing that kind of kinship these days I mean, of course we all do kinship, doesn't feel like it's quite the same thing, right? We're all dispersed. I'm on the phone with my mom, especially now, with this COVID thing, but I'm not on the phone with her nearly enough. How often am I seeing my brother and my sister? Those kinds of things, so kinship has been, I think, is more challenging now for us, than it was in Ella's time, and certainly for her, looking back over her shoulder to the ways that it had been. These feel like somewhat different sort of enterprises. But it is true, I have been, I mean, I always had this great, pride in my dad and my family, and wanting to be, close and attached to that, and also a kind of Oedipal distancing, right? I mean, like, I'm a different person. I am a different person. It's just, the way it is. Every generation is different, but my dad's first book, Custer Died for Your Sins, was 50 years old last year, 2019. And Red Earth, White Lies, his sort of like science polemic, is almost 25 years old. And I've been thinking a lot about the relation of those two books to one another. Been thinking a bit about my dad. I've been doing a little bit of writing about my dad, lately. Yeah, it's a kind of embeddedness, I think, across time and space that, sometimes we want to embrace and sometimes we don't want to embrace, and we struggle of our lives is to figure out which way we do what at what time.
Thank you. I didn't want to leave Charlie. Just, I know he had some questions.
Yeah. First, thank you for sharing your kind of your story. There's a lot of things that I kind of that resonate with me as far as like coming from a pretty prominent Native family as well, and really like kind of using those folks as like kind of mentors, like to come into who I am as an individual. And my dad's a really prominent speaker, and so like I'd always be taking notes, but also like kind of envy it in a way, like, man, like, because it kind of took him away from his family in that process, and that like skill that he'd mastered. Like everyone wanted him at different dam removal rallies, and it's just like, so it was really mixed emotions. Like, damn, I'm glad you're doing a lot of great things for our community, but like, what about us? Like kind of leaving the family in little, like in the rear view mirror in some sense. And so, but it's also important to recognize that without him, like I wouldn't be like, you know, the person I am, you know, like being in the grad program and really just like kind of launching myself into a position of success and happiness while also trying to, you know, give back to my community in the best way I can. And so it was really powerful when you spoke to that. Like you see me nodding my head all the time because I'm like, dang, like that's so deep. And especially when you're talking about your great aunt, like, you know, even though like your other great aunt is like doing really great things and is getting the recognition, your aunt Susie was just like doing her art thing, you know, and it just kind of brought this idea of like we're just different mediums, you know, whether you're vocal or you're like you're a drawer or you're an artist or you're a musician. And I did a little bit of background research, and I heard that you're a pretty you're a good musician. So I was just wondering if you wanted to like talk about how your passion for music kind of how that impacted you as like a professional as well as a person.
Mm. Yeah, I'm not really that good, but I love it. You know, I mean, so yeah, I mean, so in third grade, right? They made me play the clarinet, right? So I'm playing the clarinet in like fourth grade or fifth grade. I go to the orthodontist, you know, the dentist, and they're like, "Yeah, the clarinet is like pushing your teeth out. You're gonna have buck teeth if you keep playing the clarinet. You should play something else." The band director says, "Oh, we need trombone players." So I get stuck playing the trombone, you know. I mean, it's such a and then somewhere along the line, like I took lessons for a year, and then we moved and we went into this new school, and like all of a sudden I realized like, oh, I can actually kind of play the trombone. And before I knew it, like I became a band nerd, you know. I mean, all throughout junior high and high school, like I was a band nerd. I was a trombone band nerd. And then I majored in music, you know, as an undergrad. And somewhere along the line, then I started playing guitar. And then because I was often, guitar players will know this, right? Guitar players in my position will know this. 3 guitar players are sitting around. The 2 who were better look at the worst one and they're like, that guy can play bass. And then we need a drummer and we'll have a band. And that was always me, you know? So, you know, I'm realizing like you can see my bass right back there and a guitar or 2, you know, kind of sitting around. So, you know, more than anything else, I mean, when I was 18 to 25, 26, 27, I just wanted to play music. That's all I wanted to do, you know? And I had 2 different moments where I realized that like, I just wasn't good enough, right? That there's a thing called talent. And I had a little bit of it and I didn't have enough of it. And so I had one with the trombone and I had one with the guitar, you know? And, you know, those are super, super awful, painful moments, you know, for me, because like, we're just constantly bombarded with these messages about like, if you have a dream, follow your dream and you can do whatever you want. But it's like, sometimes you just don't really have the chops to do it, you know? And I think that's a really important lesson for me. I mentioned humility before, and I mention it, you know, because it is, you know, a fundamental Dakota virtue, and I think an indigenous virtue in so many different contexts, that like, we can't make more of ourselves than we, you know, I mean, we just shouldn't. It's just like, you know, and so for me, like sort of my own failures in music, which I, you know, sort of embrace every time I pick it up and can't play very well, you know, are just a reminder, right? That like, you know, be humble in this world, right? That's a good way to be. And if you have too much achievement, you know, it takes you away from that. So I've been trying to do multi-track. I've been learning Logic 10, you know, which is like really hard for an old guy like me. And what it reveals is like, even when I thought I could do stuff, like A, I can't sing in tune, and B, I can't play in time. So I kind of suck, basically. I don't know. It's a good lesson. I feel like I've sort of maintained that. And I've always felt like, you know, finding the right median is the way to go. Like I've said, you have to be confident enough to lead and humble enough to listen. And like, I think those are, you know, good words, you know, to live a life by. And that comes straight out of music, right? Because like I was a middle school band teacher. So when you go like this and you tell the band, like, we're going to play, when I put my fingers down, like, you're going to play, like, you have to be confident that they will actually do that. Like, you have to like lead, you know, but you have to be humble to listen. Yeah.
Yeah, Virgil, did you have a question?
Yeah, on the follow-up to that, because I think, you know, in reading the book and just learning more about your life, that there's a lot of, and like in everybody's life, a lot of complexity. And one of the things that I've took from your work and your books is at least one part of it is around identity, and, having multiple identities. I know when we had lunch in Michigan, we briefly talked about hybridity and I know in this book, one of the things that you talked about towards the latter part of the book is Susan's own identity, and you used the word biculturalism. Specifically, you said, her life suggests that both immobilizing and productive side of biculturalism, a multiplicity of cultural influences that also created possibility. And so my question to you, because I think we still wrestle with biculturalism, Charlie, myself, many indigenous native people in 2020, it's still a major issue. And so I just wanted you to talk a little bit about, that statement of her biculturalism then, and how it is, maybe similar today or different around this broad sort of indigenous or native identity.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, it feels different to me, sort of in their moment and then in our moment. Like they didn't have the caught between two cultures model, right? You've been driven out of your native culture, but you're not let into white culture, and you're existing in this kind of liminal space in between, right? That's a thing that comes out of the 60s that like we have been told over and over again, and we have then told it back to other people to the point where we sort of like talk it all the time, like I'm caught between two worlds, I'm up two worlds. Biculturalism ends up really being bi in that sense. I think one of the things I wanted to think more about with her was, I will show you one of the bi, well, maybe not, maybe I'll do that later. But I wanted us to think, like, those are spatial metaphors, right? Like I'm in this space, this is one culture, this is one culture, right? And I exist in relation to those things, and I situate myself somewhere between them, or sometimes over here, or I'm over there, or whatever. And I wanted to have like, and Charlie, this goes back to your question in a lot of ways. I wanted to have a musical metaphor, a sound metaphor, rather than a spatial metaphor, which then allowed us to think about ourselves in more complicated kind of ways. So my sound metaphor was like, you have culture coming at you from all different kinds of ways. So you're not just bicultural, you're truly multicultural. Everybody is, always is, right? And some of the things that you hear come at you really, really loud, and they shape you in certain kind of ways. And other things maybe aren't so loud, but they're very constant, right? You hear them all the time, over and over again. And those things shape you in really important, powerful ways. And sometimes things just come and they glance off your head and they go off in another direction. You never hear them again, right? But it's possible that those things also, shape you in different ways. So if you think of yourself as kind of the subject of music or sound sitting in the middle and getting stuff from all different dimensions, right? Then you might sort of like say bicultural is not really even the word, right? It's sort of like you're a complicated person with a complicated identity, sitting in the middle of all these things. And that's where I've also felt like it's important to draw a distinction between identity and subjectivity. And for me, subjectivity has always been that inner thing, that is the product of all that outer stuff. But there's something inside, right, that's a little bit, it's shaped by it, but it's not the total of it, right? Whereas identity stuff oftentimes is ascribed to you by other people, right? It's someone sitting outside saying, I look at you and I see this, and that's who you are. And that may not match your subjectivity. Your subjectivity may be saying like, I see what you're saying about me, but that's actually not, I'm more like this, over here. So it feels like there's this constant sort of clash between your own subjectivity formed by all these identity processes and the ascription of identities that people put upon you, which some part of which you then internalize, right? So it's this super complicated thing, I think, that goes back and forth. And that feels right to me, I mean, I look in the mirror and I think, you're a complicated dude, and that means that you guys are complicated, right? And that everybody out there listening is complicated. We're all complicated in that kind of way. And identity processes then that want to simplify it and distill it down and name you this as opposed to that. These things are important. They're social processes, right? And social stuff matters. So I don't want to sort of discount that, but there's other dynamics going on, and the individual, is rarely contained by the category, that he or she gets put in.
And so one follow-up to that, I think tying this to, I think because her drawings were like personality prints, right? And so you got into sort of how she was shaped by like racial intelligence and the work that Ella was with one of the sort of the foremost persons around creating the sort of racial intelligence questionnaires and just how they shaped policies going forward. And so, one of the things that you said, another quote I wanted to throw out here just to have you unpack, just to kind of help paint the book even further for the audience, is you said, in this sense, the personality prints were more than simply Mary Sully's mental pictures of individuals, or her complex engagement with modernism, or with politics of settler colonial history and Indian fraternity. They were also meant to recognize and describe the achievements of individuals, to honor their talent, the courage, virtue in a traditional sense. And so one thing is I thought of you doing that to Mary in this sense, but also like that statement is just like, what was her driving force to do the personality prints, and just and maybe in your answer wrestle with some of the ways that she wrestled with settler colonialism, with getting back to the biculturalism. There was a pull of like a lot of the racism, the settler colonialism, and society pulled her back, but then she was also able to innovate and be really creative. So there was this push-pull. So I'm just wondering if you can wrestle with a little bit more the personality prints and her reasons why, and then tying in sort of settler colonialism and all that, because I think our audience will really be interested in your thoughts about that.
Yeah. I mean, this is where I think at the end of the book, it's really important, at least to me, to sort of turn back to these Dakota epistemological things. And the one sort of one little leverage point was with this one letter, right, where she gives them this other name. Oh, the personality prints, the Luta personality prints, right? And so I talk a little bit about Luta, and it's sort of its sort of meaning as an honoring kind of strategy, and thinking about her in relation to this figure of the double woman, and artistic and aesthetic kind of excellence. Those two things, I think, for me, come together to position her and offer a motive for why she's doing, what she's doing, which is she really, truly, I think, is honoring people in this sort of, Dakota way, in the way that you might make moccasins for someone, that you would decorate, use the color red as a kind of honoring color, that you would, do those kinds of things. So, so I think she does have that as a motive. At the same time, like we were just talking about, her motives are also complicated. It's really clear she wants to make those middle panels into industrial designs and sell them and get money, because they're broke. I mean, these two sisters are broke all the time. They're always trying to get money. So, so if you want, I can sort of just quickly, to talk about the settler colonialism thing, do the share screen thing, if we can make it work. Does it work?
Yep.
Okay. So this is, for me, this is like the master key to understanding the entire collection, right? And it is, she steps outside of personalities, and she does this thing on Indian history. And I think this is all about sort of her coming to consciousness about sort of racism and what we would today call settler colonialism. So, if you look at the top panel, you can see the bottom, it's all segmented. The bottom is the sort of idyllic native world, right? Everything is green and it's beautiful. The next one up is this kind of reservation world of barbed wire and fences. And she uses only gray graphite pencil to give you a sense of the kind of despair of it. Then the next one up are these sort of silhouetted modernist figures of anxiety. And I think she's completely riffing on the African-American muralist Aaron Douglas here, and the silhouette tradition in African-American art, which tells you a little bit about her cosmopolitanism. And then the top one are these sort of feet, which are literally tromping down on these sort of native people who are trying to sort of survive modernity. And there's this sort of smoky fog, right, going through there. So here you can see like African-American muralists. I think Diego Rivera is kind of part and parcel of this. I think the comic pages are part and parcel of this sort of art. And then if you look at the second one, she's taken each of those little bands and converted them into a kind of waving pattern. But if you notice, right, that thing which was the Indian sort of band, the green and the camp, has turned into this sort of very colorful kind of explosion, right? And then if you go to the bottom, she's flipped the whole thing on its side. If you start at either of the edges, you see the tromping down feet. This time there's like blue jeans. You see these modernist figures of anxiety, sort of brown and red. And then you see the barbed wire of history, right? The bad stuff, the hurts of history, settler colonialism, right? And then you see the central band, only one, full of the color of Parfleche painting, right? Blue, yellow, red, and green, right? Overwrites all of that stuff. So there's an argument here, I think, about settler colonial domination, and there's an argument about native futurity that happens at the same time. So that's why I think that thing is this thing is so important. If you read all of the works through this thing, what you see is that every one of these collections of three, the first one starts with this kind of representation, and the bottom one is this sort of native futurity, right? The top one starts in the present moment, and it goes where? It goes into the future, right? It goes into native futurity and survivance, right? She wouldn't have used Gerald Visner's words, but that's kind of what she's talking about, right? She's rejecting, in Visner's terms, right, sort of the plastic images of Indians, the victimish, kind of narrative. She's rejecting all those things, and she's asserting the possibilities for native future. That's why I think the art is political, as well as just being art or just being cultural.
That was pretty beautiful, and I like the commentary that you had offered us with that, because all of us can interpret art very differently, and I think that's a beautiful part about art, is just how each one of our influences kind of determines or defines what art may be. And one of the things that I had a question that popped to my mind earlier when you were talking about this artwork, that you mentioned that she didn't put this art out there in that moment in time. And I have a million reasons on why that might be, but I'd like to hear from you of like, why do you think that she never released that artwork until, later on in life?
Well, I mean, she really did try. And I think, throughout the 30s, they were just really barely getting by, and it got worse and worse and worse. So by 1938, they actually put together this little promo package, which is one of the ways that I know something about the art, right? They tried to collect some letters of endorsement. They made up a list of some of the art. And it was kind of a bust, They set up little shows at the Pipestone Indian School and at Flandreau. These are two places that they spent a lot of time passing through, so they're familiar territory for them. They may have done a show at the Milwaukee Women's Club. And as far as I can tell, that's it. Those are the only times the art was ever shown. And when they showed it, I mean, basically she just took mailing tape, taped the backs of the things to reinforce them, and kind of taped them all together. And then put these little kind of photo hanger things. So they were this is all bad for the art, right? So now as we want to show these, we have to do conservation work and strip off all that tape and that gummy, gluey, kind of stuff. But I think she tried, and just, it didn't really work. And by the time, she sort of, I think, abandoned the project in the mid 1940s. And that was the moment when all of a sudden on the American art scene, you had abstract expressionism, and her stuff looks very, very old relative to that. And on the native art side, you had, Oscar Howe and folks like that, and her stuff also looks sort of old then. So there's a kind of moment where it's expired by date, kind of kicks in, sadly.
Thank you for that. And that kind of segues pretty eloquently into one of the comments in our comment section by Melissa Yazzie. In addition to, and she's curious if there are any plans to take the collection like on the road, or like any exhibits now, and now that there's like a lot more value or interest in like that story that you just explained?
Yeah, there is, I hope. I mean, I've been talking to a couple of folks. So it was really cool for me that that these things ended up in the Hearts of Our People show, that two of them did. And some of the folks who've been associated with that show, which is all Native women's art, by the way, have been thinking, well, maybe it's kind of time to sort of mount an exhibit of some of this stuff. So I'm hoping that there's a consortium of about maybe 4 or 5 really interesting, really good museums that I think are going to kind of join together. We're just in this sort of beginning stages, you know, of it, but I'm super excited to sort of think about what it would look like. I mean, when I started the thing, the project, you know, I went to these art historians and I said, hey, this is fantastic stuff, you know, or rather art curators and art museums, you guys should do a show. And they're like, yeah, your aunt's stuff from the basement is going to come into our museum. No, it's not happening. So they were saying, basically, you go write a book and force us to sort of take it seriously. And now I feel like people are kind of taking it seriously, and that's a really good thing. So I'm quite happy about it, and I'm optimistic.
That's great.
So I see we just have a couple minutes left. So, you know, I just want to, you know, thank you, Dr. Deloria. And, you know, I think that this book and has really broadened my sort of horizons, my you know, interest in just, you know, just the dedication and all the different angles you and the research that you did to understand your great aunt and her art, like just how meticulous and how many different perspectives, whether it was the context or the psychology or the politics, and really it was, you know, just a great story and really. So I say that because I think each and every one of you watching should get the book. I think that it's, you know, it really is awesome, and will open up your understanding of I think not just art, but like history and also, you know, the importance of telling the forgotten or the untold story, and those stories that are on the margins. And as I see it, you, Dr. Deloria, is that's, you know, one of the things that I really admire about you is it seems like, you know, you're always kind, open, and just like doing this interview. And so I want to thank you for that. And, you know, I think that really, you know, embodies a good, you know, role model to us that all admire you and your work. I guess the last little comment is what's next for you at Harvard? Anything that we should look out for, or anything, or any last words that you'd like to say?
I mean, I'm working on a set of essays right now that have to do with sort of the narrative politics of American liberalism, which have a lot to do with sort of African-American history as not necessarily told to African-American advantage, but told to advantage the white liberal state. So it's a theoretical kind of project in which I'm really trying to sort of think about putting settler colonialism and indigenous peoples and histories at the very center of American history. So I'm working on that, you know, right now, and working on some of this stuff for getting these things, the pieces of art, you know, up on the wall somewhere. Yeah. So those are the things that are new for me, basically.
Okay. Thank you. Turn over to Charlie to wrap it all up.
Yeah, I want to thank you too. I also wanted to take this time. I've been asking the presenters just like kind of a way to kind of wrap it up. What do you think would be one word that would explain or begin to explain or describe Native peoples?
You know, can I have 2 words?
Yeah.
So I've been really a lot sort of trying to put 2 words into play on this question. One is futurity, because I think this is super important, right? I mean, futurity pushes back against all the settler colonial erasures, right? It's a word that encapsulates, you know, all of that. And the other word is autochthonous. And I chose that word because it's like, it's got 4 consonants together and I can never spell it. And it's like, and it's a word from geology, but it just means, you know, originary, right, in place, in the, you know, and in this continent, in this land, you know, in place. So I found it really important to talk about this in relation to sovereignty. And this is a little bit sort of like kind of where Taiaya K. Alford and other folks have come from, is like, it's too easy to read sovereignty as only a Western construct, which takes on its reality and, you know, treaty form, and that requires sort of, but when you think about autochthonous sovereignty, right, sort of native peoples in place as, you know, viable, active, smart, you know, funny, engaged societies, you know, over tens of thousands of years, you know, in this place. And then you put that with futurity. Those are my words.
Wow, I'm so glad I asked you that question. Thank you again
That was nice.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
I want to thank you guys for having me and let me talk about the book and share it with other people. It's just really quite a pleasure and quite an honor. So thank you so much.
All righty. All right, for the rest of you, the audience out there, we're looking forward to you turning around tomorrow, having a really good talk with the local Phil Albers. I'm really excited, someone I've always looked up to. So I'm excited for you all to get to hear from what he has to say and from his perspective. I think we could all learn something from him. But until then, Two Feathers is out. Soon.